The old man's hand froze mid-air, his phone screen still glowing between us. He looked at the photo, then he looked at me, then back at the photo again, like his eyes refused to accept what his mind already understood. My brother's laughter died somewhere in his throat. Nobody at that table knew it yet, but the version of me they thought they were mocking 20 minutes earlier had just walked back into the room, and this time no one was going to tell me to sit down. I hadn't even wanted to come to that dinner. I'd landed 6 hours earlier after a deployment rotation that left me running on coffee and adrenaline, and the last thing I wanted was small talk in a dress I hadn't worn in over a year. But my mother had called twice, her voice doing that thing it does when she wants something and doesn't want to admit it's an obligation dressed up as a favor. "It's just a family dinner, Rebecca. You should come." I should have known better. My mother has never once described anything involving my brother as just anything. The restaurant was the kind of place with candlelight that flickered exactly enough to look expensive, and a wine list longer than most contracts I'd signed. Daniel was already at the head of the table when I arrived, holding court the way he always did, laughing a beat too loud at his own jokes, touching people's shoulders like he owned a piece of the room. Around him sat men in blazers that fit too well, and women who nodded at everything he said. This wasn't a family dinner, this was a pitch, and I was late to figure out I was part of the set dressing. "There she is," Daniel said when he spotted me waving me toward an empty chair like I was a delivery he'd been expecting. He didn't stand. He didn't hug me. He just gestured already, turning back to the man beside him. "This is my sister Rebecca. She's in the army." That was it, 11 words. No rank, no unit, no acknowledgement that I'd been gone for months doing work that mattered. Just, she's in the army, the way you'd mention a hobby someone had grown out of. One of the men, silver-haired, kind-eyed, leaned toward me with genuine curiosity. "Oh, what do you do in the army?" "I'm an army officer," I said simply. I've never seen the point in performing my career for people who weren't going to remember my name in a week. Daniel laughed before I'd even finished the sentence. "She's always been like this, real serious, thinks the uniform makes her interesting." He said it with a grin that invited everyone else to laugh along, and most of them did the polite kind of laughter people give the host. Not because it's funny, but because it's easier than not laughing. I didn't argue. I never do. Somewhere along the way, I'd learned that explaining yourself to people who've already decided who you are is just wasted breath. The evening rolled on that way, Daniel steering every conversation back toward himself, his company, his vision, his numbers. When one of the guests, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, asked me a genuine question about logistics coordination, Daniel cut in before I could answer. "Trust me, she doesn't know anything about business." He said it warmly, like he was protecting me from embarrassing myself. I felt my jaw tighten, but I said nothing. Then he decided I was sitting in the wrong seat. "Actually," he said, standing and gesturing toward a chair further down the table, away from the two men closest to him, the ones who mattered most tonight. "Why don't you sit over there? Give these gentlemen some room." I looked at him for a moment, long enough that a couple of people noticed. I picked up my glass, my napkin, and started to rise because making a scene has never been my style. But Daniel leaned down as I moved his voice low enough that only I could hear it, but sharp enough that it landed like a slap. "Sit down and be quiet," he said. Then straightening, adding just loud enough for the table, "You have no idea who you're sitting with." I stood there for a second, glass in hand, feeling something settle inside me. Not anger. Something colder, steadier than that. "You're right about one thing, Daniel," I said, my voice, even my eyes, not leaving his. "You have no idea who you're sitting with either." He laughed, a short, dismissive bark of a laugh, already turning back toward his guests, like I'd said something cute and forgettable. A couple of people chuckled along with him, assuming it was nothing, some sibling jab that meant nothing beneath the surface. But at the far end of the table, an older man hadn't laughed at all. He was staring at me, really staring, the kind of look that makes you check if you have something on your face. Then slowly he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He unlocked it, scrolled, found something. His eyes moved from the screen to my face, then back to the screen again, his brow furrowing like he was solving a puzzle he hadn't expected to find at a dinner party. "Wait," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. He stood up, chair scraping against the floor. Every conversation at the table faltered the way rooms do when something shifts and nobody can yet say what. "Is that really you?" he asked, turning the phone toward me, his voice thick with disbelief. Daniel's head snapped toward me, and for the first time all evening, the confidence on his face began to crack. The whole table had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that makes silverware sound like gunfire. I looked at the phone the old man was holding toward me, and I already knew what he'd found before I even saw the screen clearly. A photo from an official Army release months old, taken after a logistics support initiative I'd helped coordinate for military families relocating overseas. I hadn't asked for the photo to be taken. I hadn't asked for it to be published either, but there it was apparently, sitting in some stranger's phone at a dinner I never wanted to attend. Major Thompson. He asked, his voice careful, like he was testing whether the name still belonged to the woman standing in front of him. I felt every eye at the table land on me at once, Daniel's included. "Yes, sir," I said, keeping my voice level the same way I would have answered on any base in any briefing room to any commanding officer. There was no triumph in it. I wasn't performing. I was simply telling the truth. The same truth I'd been telling all evening without anyone caring enough to ask. The man's face broke into something between astonishment and respect. He rounded the table quickly, hand already extended before he reached me. "Mark Caldwell," he said, shaking my hand with both of his. "I served on the board for a Veterans Family Support Initiative a few years back. I read about the logistics work you did resettling military families during that base transition. That was some of the most thoughtful coordination I'd seen come out of a program like that." He shook his head, still processing. "I didn't expect to be sitting across from you tonight." I thanked him quietly. I didn't elaborate. I've never known what to do with praise like that, so I usually just let it pass through the room rather than trying to hold on to it. Daniel, for his part, looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him without warning. "Wait," he said, his voice higher than usual, the practiced charm slipping for just a second. "You're actually a major—" "I never said I wasn't," I replied. It was true, I'd never lied to him. I'd simply never volunteered information to a family that had long ago decided my career was something to tolerate rather than something to know. There's a difference between hiding and simply not being asked, and Daniel had never once asked. Mark turned to Daniel, his tone shifting from warmth to something more pointed. "You never told us your sister was an Army officer." Daniel forced a laugh, adjusting his collar. "She doesn't really talk about herself. You know how it is." The words hung there a moment too long. Because it wasn't that I didn't talk about myself. It was that for the entire evening, Daniel had actively spoken over me around me, and about me painting a picture of a sister who didn't understand business, didn't understand ambition, didn't understand anything worth understanding at that table. And now the picture didn't match the woman standing in front of everyone. I could have used that moment. I could have listed my deployments, my commendations, the operations I'd led. It would have been easy and it would have been satisfying in the way petty things sometimes are. But that's never been who I am. Instead, I just said simply, "I came here because my mother asked me to." That quiet answer did something the bragging never could have. I watched Mark's expression shift. Something like genuine respect settling into his features, the kind you can't manufacture with a title or a photograph. The dinner tried to right itself after that. Daniel, visibly rattled but unwilling to let the room slip out of his control, steered the conversation back toward his company, back toward the numbers he'd been building all night like a house made of good lighting and confident tone. He talked about contracts, about growth projections, about a family business built on trust. I listened mostly out of habit. The same instinct that made me double-check supply manifests even when someone else swore they were accurate. And that's when I noticed it. A small inconsistency, the kind most people wouldn't catch unless they were used to looking for gaps in reports that were supposed to be airtight. A timeline that didn't quite line up. A revenue figure that shifted slightly between two sentences 4 minutes apart. I said nothing. I filed it away the way you file away anything that doesn't sit right, waiting to see if it mattered later. It was near the end of the meal after Mark had returned to his seat and the conversation had drifted into more comfortable territory that Daniel turned to me with a look I recognized from childhood. It was the look he used to get right before he was about to make something my fault. "Rebecca," he said loud enough for the table to hear, "since you're here, maybe you can explain why you haven't helped the family more." I set my glass down slowly. "Helped with what?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his tone light, almost playful, but his eyes weren't playful at all. I didn't know exactly what he was talking about, not the specifics, but I understood the shape of it immediately, the same way you understand a storm is coming before the first drop of rain falls. Daniel wasn't just trying to embarrass me anymore. He was preparing to make me responsible for something I hadn't agreed to. I didn't press him at the table, whatever Daniel meant by helping the family more. I wasn't going to let him unpack it in front of a room full of people he was trying to impress. I simply excused myself not long after, thanked Mark again for his kind words, and left before Daniel could turn the moment into another performance. It wasn't until 2 days later that the pieces started coming together, and not because Daniel told me anything directly. My mother called her voice doing the careful, rehearsed thing it does when she's been asked to deliver a message she doesn't fully understand herself. "Daniel just needs you to sign a few papers," she said like it was the smallest request in the world. "What papers?" I asked. There was a pause, too long a pause. "You'll have to ask him about the details." That's when I knew something was wrong. My mother has never been able to hide discomfort well, and the way she skated around the question told me more than any explanation could have. I didn't confront anyone right away. I've spent enough years in logistics to know that panic makes you sloppy. And sloppy is how people miss the details that actually matter. So instead I went back through the legal documents I'd received over the past year. Things I'd skimmed and filed away without much thought. Because I trusted foolishly that my family wouldn't hand me anything without telling me exactly what it was. What I found didn't just concern me, it unsettled me in a way I hadn't expected. Buried in the family estate paperwork from after our father passed was a property Daniel and I had inherited jointly with our mother, a small commercial lot that had sat mostly untouched for years, more sentimental than valuable. But recent records showed Daniel had used it or attempted to use it as collateral for a business loan. My name was listed as a co-owner willing to support the arrangement. I had never signed anything of the kind. I called a civil attorney the next morning, someone unconnected to our family, someone who wouldn't feel obligated to soften the truth for the sake of keeping peace at holiday dinners. She reviewed everything I sent her and called me back within the day. "You haven't signed any guarantee," she confirmed. "Legally, you're not responsible for any of his debt. But some of this language is deliberately misleading, written in a way that could confuse a lender into believing you'd already agreed to something. If your brother continues representing your name this way, it could become a serious legal issue for both of you." I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up. Not anger yet, just a strange, hollow disbelief, the kind that comes right before anger, when you're still trying to convince yourself there's an innocent explanation. Daniel called that evening, his voice already defensive before I'd said a word. "You're my sister," he said. "You should help me." "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" I asked. There was a beat of silence, and then he said the thing that changed everything. "Because you would have made everything complicated." I didn't respond right away. I let the words settle, let them show me exactly what they meant. Daniel hadn't hidden the truth from me because he was ashamed. He'd hidden it because he'd already decided how he wanted to use me, and asking permission wasn't part of the plan. I wasn't his sister in that moment. I was a resource, a name he thought he could borrow without consequence. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, the phone screen dark in front of me, my coffee going cold. I thought about every family dinner I'd sat through where Daniel's ambitions were treated like gravity, something everyone else had to orbit around. I thought about every time I'd been told gently, or not so gently, to be smaller, quieter, more agreeable for the sake of keeping things easy. Later that night, going through old emails while double-checking the property documents, I found something I hadn't expected. An email Daniel had sent to a business partner nearly 8 months earlier, long before that dinner, long before any of this had come to a head. "My sister has military connections," he'd written. "Having her name associated with this project will make investors feel safer." I read it twice then, a third time my hand tightening slightly around my mug. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a one-time slip in a moment of desperation. Daniel had planned this. He had looked at my service, my reputation, everything I had built with years of discipline and sacrifice, and decided it was simply another asset he could quietly attach to his company's name. I set the phone down and stared at the wall for a while, letting the reality of it settle fully. My brother hadn't invited me to that dinner because he wanted me there. He'd invited me because without my knowledge or consent, I had already become part of his pitch. I didn't call Daniel back that night, and I didn't call him the next day either. Whatever satisfaction there might have been in confronting him immediately, I let it go. Anger makes noise. Noise doesn't win anything. If Daniel had spent months quietly building a story around my name, then I was going to spend however long it took quietly taking that story apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for him to stand on. I started with the documents. Every email my attorney could legally help me gather, every text message Daniel had ever sent referencing the property or the loan, every contract that mentioned my name without my signature attached to it. I laid it all out the way I would organize a supply manifest before a deployment, categorized, dated, cross-referenced. I wasn't interested in exaggeration. I wanted the truth complete and undeniable. Because the truth doesn't need to be embellished to be devastating. I didn't use my rank to intimidate anyone. I didn't call in favors or make threats. I did what any disciplined person would do when faced with a lie large enough to swallow a family whole. I documented it, and I let the people with the authority to act on it see it clearly. Mark called me 3 days later. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice heavier than it had been at the dinner. "I had no idea your brother was using your name to build credibility with investors. If I'd known, I would have asked more questions from the start. I don't want revenge," I told him, and I meant it. "I want the truth on the table. What people do with it after that is up to them." Mark was quiet for a moment, and then he said he intended to review Daniel's company records more thoroughly before making any final decisions about the investment he'd been considering. I thanked him, and that was the end of the call. No manipulation, no persuasion. I'd learned a long time ago that the truth rarely needs a push. It just needs room to breathe. Daniel didn't take it well. He called that same evening, his voice sharp before I'd even said hello. "You embarrassed me," he snapped. "You embarrassed yourself," I said calmly. "I just stopped covering for it. You think that uniform makes you untouchable?" He shot back, his voice rising. "No," I said. "The truth does." He hung up without another word, and for a moment I just stood there in my kitchen phone in hand, feeling strangely steady. I'd expected the confrontation to hurt more than it did. Instead, it felt like setting down something heavy I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. My mother called not long after, her voice trembling in that particular way that used to make me second-guess myself when I was younger. "He's your brother," she said, like the words alone were supposed to settle everything. "Being family doesn't give him permission to use my name," I said. There was a long pause on the line, the kind that told me she didn't have a real answer for that. I thought about all the years I'd spent making myself smaller, so Daniel could feel bigger, all the birthdays and holidays where his achievements were toasted, and mine were mentioned in passing, if at all. I thought about every time someone had said, "He's your brother," as though that phrase alone erased everything he'd ever done. Nobody had ever once asked what Daniel had done for me. Not once. In over 30 years. I didn't say all of that to my mother. I didn't need to relive it out loud to know it was true. A few days later, Mark sent me a document by email, one he'd pulled directly from a set of materials Daniel had used to court a group of investors. My name was listed near the bottom of an advisory page, attached to a title I had never held in my entire career. Daniel hadn't just borrowed my reputation. He had fabricated a role for me, inventing a position that didn't exist to make his company look more credible in the eyes of people who trusted institutions like the military far more than they trusted him. I sat with the document open on my screen for a long time, feeling something settle deep in my chest, quiet but absolute. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't a brother stretching the truth in a moment of desperation. This was deliberate, calculated. A man who had spent his entire life believing his ambitions mattered more than anyone else's integrity, mine included. I thought back to that dinner, to the way he'd leaned down and told me to sit somewhere else, to lower my voice, to make room for the people who actually mattered. "You have no idea who you're sitting with," he'd said. I closed my laptop gently and allowed myself a small, tired smile. He had no idea how right he was. I met with my attorney the following week, and together we laid out everything in a way that made the full scope of it impossible to ignore. It wasn't just one lie. It was a structure built carefully over months, with each piece supporting the next. My name and image used without consent. A fabricated title attached to a company I had no involvement with. Documents suggesting I endorsed a business I'd never even reviewed. And beneath all of it, the property Daniel had quietly tried to leverage, along with a growing pile of debt he had clearly been trying to keep hidden from everyone, including our mother. "This isn't just embarrassing for him," my attorney said, tapping the folder in front of her. "Depending on how far he's taken it with investors, this could be legally serious." I nodded slowly. I wasn't looking for legal consequences to fall on Daniel like some kind of punishment I'd orchestrated. I just wanted the lying to stop, and I wanted it to stop in a way that couldn't quietly start again the moment I looked away. So I sent him something clear and unambiguous. No emotion in it, no accusations dressed up as anger, just boundaries spelled out plainly. He was not to use my name. He was not to use my image. He was not to imply in any conversation or document that I supported his company in any capacity. And he was not to contact any of my professional or personal connections in an effort to influence them on his behalf. Daniel's response was almost exactly what I expected. He laughed it off in a text, calling it dramatic, telling me I was overreacting to a few misunderstandings. He didn't believe I would actually follow through. He'd spent so many years assuming my quiet nature meant passivity that he genuinely couldn't imagine me holding a line and keeping it there. Mark called not long after that. Until these records are independently verified. He said, his voice firm, but not unkind, I can't move forward with the investment. That single decision unraveled something Daniel had spent months building. Without Mark's backing, other potential partners started asking questions of their own. The kind of questions that don't have comfortable answers when your foundation is built on borrowed credibility. I heard through my mother, who heard through Daniel, that another investor had quietly pulled out entirely within the week. He blamed me for all of it, of course. The family meeting my mother arranged a few days later felt less like a conversation and more like an ambush dressed in politeness. Daniel sat across from me, jaw-tight, eyes rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from watching something you built with lies begin to crumble. You destroyed my business, he said, his voice low and accusatory. No, I said, keeping my tone even. I stopped protecting your lie. My mother's eyes filled with tears, her hands twisting in her lap the way they always did when she wanted a situation to resolve itself without her having to choose a side. Rebecca, please, she said softly. I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't soften just to make her more comfortable. I spent years protecting this family from embarrassment, I said. I'm done protecting people from the consequences of their own choices. The room went quiet. Daniel stared at the table, his hands clenched, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say out loud. When he finally spoke, it wasn't an apology. It was something closer to a confession, wrapped in defiance. Fine, he said. I used your name, but everyone does what they have to do to survive. I looked at my brother for a long moment, taking in the version of him sitting there stripped of the polish and charm he usually wrapped around himself like armor. There was no triumph in what I felt, just a quiet, settled clarity. Then you're finally going to have to do what you have to do, I said, without me. I stood, gathered my things, and left the room without waiting for a response. Behind me, I heard my mother start to cry, and I heard Daniel say nothing at all because for the first time in his life, there was nothing left for him to say that would fix what he'd broken. The weeks that followed moved quietly the way real consequences usually do. There was no dramatic collapse, no single moment where everything fell apart all at once. Instead, it happened the way a structure fails when its foundation is compromised slowly, then altogether. Once the records were independently verified, the inconsistencies Daniel had spent months hiding became impossible to explain away. The bank asked for clarification on the collateral he'd listed. 2 more investors quietly withdrew their interest. A longtime client requested a full review of an existing contract, unwilling to move forward without confirming that everything Daniel had told them was accurate. None of it happened because I made a single phone call demanding punishment. It happened because Daniel had built his business on a foundation of borrowed trust, and once people realized that trust wasn't real, they simply stopped extending it. My attorney also uncovered something during the property review that confirmed what I'd already suspected. Daniel had been quietly working to pressure our mother into signing documents that would have effectively removed my legal claim to the family property we jointly inherited, framing it to her as a simple formality rather than what it actually was. I want to be clear about something, because it mattered to me at the time, and it still matters now. I never tried to take anything that wasn't mine. I didn't go after Daniel's share of the property. I didn't try to claim more than I was legally entitled to. I simply refused to let him quietly take what was mine without my knowledge, which is a very different thing from greed, no matter how he tried to frame it to people willing to listen. Daniel showed up at my apartment one evening about 2 weeks after the family meeting. He looked different than I'd ever seen him. The confidence stripped away, replaced by something tired and unfamiliar. I need you, he said, standing in my doorway like the words cost him something to say out loud. You needed me before, I replied. You just didn't respect me. He didn't argue with that. He couldn't, not really. He asked if I would sign a document to help stabilize what was left of the company, some restructuring agreement that required family cooperation to move forward smoothly with the bank. I'm not signing anything I haven't independently reviewed, I told him, and I meant every word of it. I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice, trusting blindly because we shared a last name. He stood there for a moment, and something in his expression shifted, hardened. So that's it, he asked. You're choosing strangers over your own brother. No, I said quietly. I'm choosing myself for the first time in a long time. He left without another word, and I closed the door gently behind him, feeling none of the satisfaction people probably expect in moments like that. Just a tired kind of peace, the sort that comes from finally putting down something you've been carrying for far too long. A few days later, Mark reached out and asked if I would be willing to attend a meeting with several of the people who had been involved in reviewing Daniel's company records. I almost said no. I had no interest in watching my brother's downfall unfold in real time as some kind of spectator sport. But Mark explained that my presence mattered not for revenge, but because Daniel had spent months building a narrative around who I was, and it felt important that people finally hear the truth directly from me instead of secondhand. So I went. This time no one asked me to move my seat. No one introduced me as an afterthought. I sat where I chose, and when Mark spoke, his voice carried the calm authority of someone who had seen enough in his life to know exactly what accountability looked like. Major Thompson was never involved in this company, he said, looking directly at Daniel. You made people believe she was, and that decision has consequences beyond just this deal. Daniel didn't argue. He couldn't. The paperwork in front of everyone made denial pointless. And for the first time since I'd known him, my brother sat in a room full of people and said absolutely nothing in his own defense. Near the end of the meeting, one of the men present someone who had clearly grown tired of half answers and careful language, looked directly at Daniel and asked, "Is there anything else you haven't told us?" The room went still. Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes dropping to the table in front of him. He didn't answer right away. And in that silence I felt something settle in my chest, a quiet certainty that had been building for weeks. There was still one more thing. I could see it in the way he wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. One more lie waiting to surface. The last secret came out almost gently, the way the worst truths sometimes do, without shouting, without drama, just quiet words in a room that had already grown tired of surprises. Daniel had told one of his partners months earlier that I would personally help connect the company to a federal support program designed for veteran-owned and military-affiliated businesses. It wasn't true. I had never made that promise. I had never even known the program existed, until my attorney found the correspondence buried in an email chain Daniel had assumed no one would ever read closely. I didn't raise my voice when I addressed it. I've never found volume to be useful in moments that actually matter. I simply placed the documents on the table one after another in the same steady rhythm I would use organizing a briefing. Emails, messages, contracts. Slide decks he'd used in investor presentations, my name embedded in places I had never agreed to be. Mark looked through them carefully, his expression hardening with each page. "This isn't a misunderstanding," he said, finally setting the last document down. Daniel had nothing left to offer. No explanation, no clever reframing, no charm to soften the moment. He sat there silent, the same man who had once told an entire dinner table that I didn't understand business, that I was too serious, that I needed to be quiet and stay in my place. I looked at him for a long moment, and something in me finally let the memory surface, fully the one I'd been carrying since that first night. "Remember what you told me that night?" I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I could see the memory land behind his eyes. "Sit down and be quiet," I said, my voice even carrying just enough to fill the room without needing to rise. A few people shifted in their seats, sensing the weight settling over the moment. "You were right about one thing," I continued, holding his gaze. "I didn't know who I was sitting with that night." He looked at me, something fragile breaking across his face, the practiced confidence gone entirely. "But neither did you." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Daniel's face had gone pale, the kind of pale that has nothing to do with lighting and everything to do with finally understanding the cost of every choice you've made. He didn't defend himself. He didn't posture. For the first time in his life, my brother simply sat there and let the truth exist in the room without trying to reshape it. In the weeks that followed, Daniel faced what he had built for himself. The company's debts became his to untangle alone. The investors were gone for good. His professional relationships, the ones he'd leaned on so heavily, grew distant and cautious. He hired his own attorney and began the long, unglamorous process of cleaning up what months of dishonesty had left behind. I want to be honest about something because I think it matters more than any dramatic ending could. I never tried to destroy my brother. I never wanted his ruin. I simply stopped lending my name, my silence, and my patience to something that was never mine to support in the first place. My mother came to see me not long after everything settled. She looked smaller than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. "I spent so many years making excuses for him," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. I think somewhere along the way I convinced myself that protecting him meant I didn't have to really look at what he was doing. I don't need you to punish him, Mom, I told her gently. I just needed you to believe me. She reached for my hand, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, it felt like she actually saw me. Not the quiet daughter who was easy to overlook, but the woman who had spent years building a life on discipline and honesty, even when no one at that table seemed to notice. A few months later, I returned to my unit, back to the rhythm of a life that had always made sense to me in ways my family never quite understood. One evening, I received a message from Mark. "You handled yourself with more integrity than most people I've met," he wrote. I didn't respond with anything long. I simply smiled, set the phone down, and went back to work because some victories don't need to be explained. They just need to be lived. My brother once believed the uniform was what gave me power that night. He was wrong. It was never the uniform. It was knowing exactly who I was, understanding my own limits, and refusing to let loyalty be twisted into something it was never meant to be. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear where it found you. Drop a comment below and let me know what part hit hardest, because stories like Rebecca's remind us that quiet strength often speaks louder than any room full of noise. We share stories like this every single day, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep walking through these journeys together.